I was standing knee-deep in my own backyard when I realized the HOA president was about to destroy everything I loved about my property. And she had no idea she was signing the death warrant for every luxury home in Riverside Meadows. My name is Daniel Cooper, and I bought my slice of paradise in Henderson, Nevada 3 years ago specifically because of the natural creek that wound through my 5-acre property. The house was modest compared to the McMansions that dominated the rest of the development, but I didn't care. I had running water, wildlife, and peace. The creek had been there for thousands of years, carving its path through the desert landscape, fed by underground springs and seasonal rainfall from the spring mountains. It was registered with the county as a natural waterway, protected under Nevada environmental statutes. And it was the main reason I'd paid premium prices for what the HOA considered an inferior lot. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning in late February when I found Brenda Hutchinson standing at my fence line with a clipboard. Her blonde hair sprayed into submission despite the desert wind, wearing a pantsuit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage. "Mr. Cooper," she called out, her voice carrying that particular tone of someone who believes they're doing you a favor while ruining your day. "We need to discuss your drainage problem." I walked over, my boots squelching in the damp soil. "What drainage problem?" "The creek's been here longer than this development. It's not a problem, it's a natural feature." Brenda's smile was the kind you give to a child who doesn't understand why they can't eat candy for dinner. "The HOA board has received numerous complaints about water accumulation in the common areas during rain events. Our engineering consultant has determined that your creek is the source of the flooding in the lower neighborhoods." I stared at her. "Brenda, the creek flows away from the development. It runs east toward Lake Las Vegas. It's been doing this since before humans lived in Nevada. How exactly is it flooding homes that are uphill from it?" She tapped her clipboard with a manicured nail. "Our consultant disagrees. We'll be implementing corrective measures starting next week." "I'm here as a courtesy to inform you." "What kind of corrective measures?" "Strategic water flow management installations." She said it like she was reading from a brochure. "We'll be placing concrete barriers along the creek bed to redirect water flow and prevent future flooding incidents." My stomach dropped. "You're going to block the creek?" "Brenda, that's insane. It's also probably illegal. This is a registered natural waterway. You can't just dam it up." "We're not damming anything, Mr. Cooper. We're managing water flow in accordance with our authority over common area drainage under Section 12.4 of the HOA covenants. The work will begin Monday, February 24th. Good day." She turned and walked back to her white Mercedes SUV before I could respond. I stood there watching her drive away, my mind racing through everything I knew about water rights, property law, and HOA regulations. I'd read the covenants when I bought the place. Section 12.4 dealt with drainage ditches and storm sewers in common areas. My creek wasn't a drainage ditch. It was a natural stream with its own ecosystem, complete with desert cottontails that came to drink at dawn and red-tailed hawks that hunted along its banks. I spent the rest of the day making phone calls. First to the county assessor's office, who confirmed the creek was registered as a natural waterway. Then to a lawyer friend in Las Vegas who specialized in property disputes. His name was Marcus Webb, and I'd helped him with some IT consulting work 2 years back. "Danny," Marcus said after I'd explained the situation, "they can't legally obstruct a natural waterway without permits from about 6 different agencies. The EPA alone would have their heads. Not to mention Nevada Department of Wildlife, the County Water Authority, and probably the Bureau of Land Management since some of that water eventually feeds into federal lands. So what do I do? Send them a cease and desist letter. I'll draft it tonight. Email it to the HOA board and follow up with certified mail. If they proceed, they'll be in violation of state and federal environmental protection statutes. You could sue for damages and they'd lose badly." I felt some of the tension leave my shoulders. "Thanks, Marcus. I'll wait for that letter. Don't worry too much. HOAs are used to pushing around homeowners who don't know their rights. Once they realize you've got legal counsel and you know the law, they'll back off. Nobody wants that kind of liability. Marcus was wrong. The letter went out Wednesday via email and overnight courier. I got a read receipt on the email Thursday morning. Friday afternoon, Brenda replied with a single paragraph stating that the HOA board had consulted with their legal team and determined they were well within their rights to proceed with water management infrastructure improvements. Work would commence as scheduled. I called Marcus again. They're ignoring it. Then they're idiots. Look, you've got two options. File for a temporary restraining order or let them do it and sue them afterward for damages and restoration costs. The restraining order might not come through before Monday, and it'll cost you about $2,000 in filing fees and court costs. What's option 2 cost me? Nothing upfront. When they cause environmental damage, which they will, you document everything. Photos, videos, wildlife impact, property damage, all of it. Then we sue for actual damages, punitive damages, legal fees, and restoration costs. You'll probably end up ahead financially, and the HOA will have to pay for everything including returning the creek to its natural state. I didn't like letting them wreck the creek, even temporarily, but I also didn't have $2,000 lying around for court fees. Option 2, but I'm documenting everything. Smart. This is going to get interesting. Monday morning arrived with the rumble of heavy equipment. I called in sick to my job at the data center and set up my camera on a tripod at the back fence. 3 dump trucks, an excavator, and a concrete pumping truck rolled onto the service road that ran along the eastern edge of the development. Behind them came a white pickup with Desert Flow Engineering Solutions painted on the side. The crew chief was a leathery guy in his 50s wearing a high-visibility vest and an expression that said he'd rather be anywhere else. I walked down to meet him at the fence line. "Morning," I called out. "You guys here for the creek?" He nodded, pulling out a rolled set of plans. "Yeah, you the homeowner?" "I am. Name's Daniel Cooper. Look, I need to tell you that this creek is a registered natural waterway. What you're about to do is probably illegal under state and federal environmental protection laws." He sighed, the sound of a man who'd had this conversation before. "Buddy, I just do what I'm paid to do. The HOA hired us. They say they've got the permits. I do the work." "You got a problem, take it up with them." "Do you mind if I see those permits?" "I don't have them." "The HOA does. Now I've got a schedule to keep, so if you'll excuse me." The excavator roared to life and began making its way toward the creek. I went back to my camera and started recording. Over the next 6 hours, I watched them commit what I was certain was environmental vandalism. They started by using the excavator to dig trenches perpendicular to the creek flow at 30-foot intervals. Each trench was about 6 feet deep and stretched the width of the creek bed, which varied from 8 to 12 feet across. Then they brought in the concrete. Load after load of quicksetting concrete got pumped into those trenches, creating solid barriers that rose about 4 feet above the natural creek bed. By the end of the day, they'd installed 7 barriers along the quarter-mile stretch that ran through my property and into the common area beyond. The creek water, which had been flowing peacefully that morning, was already backing up behind the first barrier. By the time the crew packed up and left at 5 in the evening, the water had risen nearly 3 feet and was starting to spread out across the creek bed, turning the narrow channel into a wide, shallow pond. I took probably 300 photos and 2 hours of video from multiple angles. I documented the company name, the equipment, the process, and especially the rising water. Then I called Marcus. "They actually did it," I told him. 7 concrete barriers, each one completely blocking the creek flow. How's the water reacting, pooling behind the barriers? "It's already flooding into areas that are normally dry." "Perfect. Keep documenting. It's going to get worse before it gets better, and that's exactly what we need for the lawsuit. Every bit of damage is going to be on them." Tuesday morning, the water behind the first barrier had risen to over 5 feet. The creek, which normally flowed at a depth of maybe 18 inches, had transformed into a pond that stretched 50 feet back into my property. Water was seeping into the soil, saturating the ground and killing the desert vegetation that wasn't adapted to constant submersion. I went to work, but came home at lunch to take more photos. The water had spread even further. By evening, it had reached the fence line at the back of my property and was starting to seep under it into the common area behind my house. Wednesday brought the first complaint to the HOA that wasn't mine. Greg Martinez, who lived 2 houses down from me in one of the bigger homes, called me that evening. "Danny, you know anything about why my backyard is turning into a swamp? I've got standing water along my whole back fence. The HOA blocked my creek, water's backing up and spreading out." Jesus, why would they do that? They claim it's causing flooding in the lower neighborhoods. That's insane. We're on the high side. Water doesn't flow uphill. Greg worked as a civil engineer, and I could hear the disbelief in his voice. Who signed off on this? Brenda Hutchinson and the HOA board. They said they had an engineering consultant. What consultant? I know every engineering firm in Henderson. Give me a day, I'm going to make some calls. Thursday morning, I woke up to 6 inches of water in my garage. The seepage from the backed-up creek had saturated the ground so thoroughly that groundwater was rising through the foundation. I documented everything, then called my insurance company. They sent an adjuster out that afternoon, a tired-looking woman named Patricia who took one look at the situation and shook her head. "This is going to be a third-party claim," she told me. The water damage is clearly caused by the creek obstruction, which means whoever obstructed the creek is liable. You'll need to file against their insurance, not yours. The HOA did it. Then you file against the HOA's liability insurance. I'll send you the paperwork and my report. You're going to want a lawyer. Already got one. Greg called me that evening with news. I found the consultant. Desert Flow Engineering Solutions is run by a guy named Rick Paulson. He got his engineering degree from an online diploma mill, and he's been cited 3 times by the state licensing board for substandard work. He's also Brenda Hutchinson's brother-in-law. Of course he was. That's corruption. It's nepotism at minimum, probably conflicts of interest. I'm drafting a formal complaint to the state licensing board. But Danny, there's something else. I pulled the hydrology reports for this development from when it was permitted back in 2019. Your creek is the primary drainage for the entire eastern slope. All the water from rain and runoff naturally flows toward that creek and then away from the development. By blocking it, they've created a dam that's going to back water up into every property on this side of Riverside Meadows. How many homes? 42, including mine. Friday proved Greg right. I woke up to frantic knocking on my door at 6 in the morning. It was Melissa Chen, who lived in one of the luxury homes 3 streets over. Her property was worth probably $2 million, all marble countertops and custom finishes. Daniel, right? We met at the community barbecue last summer? Yeah, what's going on? My basement is flooding. I've got 3 inches of water in my finished basement and it's getting worse. My neighbor said something about the creek being blocked. I explained the situation while she stood on my porch looking increasingly horrified. How much damage are we talking? My garage is flooded. The ground is completely saturated, and it's going to keep getting worse because there's nowhere for the water to go. Can they unblock it? They should, but so far the HOA is refusing to admit they did anything wrong. By noon, Melissa had apparently spread the word. I got calls from 6 different neighbors, all reporting water in their basements, garages, or crawl spaces. The luxury homes in Riverside Meadows were built into the slope, which meant most of them had basements or lower levels. As the groundwater rose from the backed-up creek, it was infiltrating those lower levels through foundations that were never designed to handle constant water pressure. Saturday morning brought an emergency HOA meeting. The notice went out via email Friday night, probably in response to the flood of complaints Brenda was receiving. The meeting was scheduled for 10 in the morning at the community center. I arrived 15 minutes early to find the parking lot already full. Inside, the community center's main room was packed with angry homeowners. I recognized most of them, at least by sight. Greg was there, along with Melissa and about 30 others. The HOA board sat at a table at the front. Brenda Hutchinson as president, Todd Waverly as vice president, and Karen Stephenson as secretary-treasurer. Yes, one of them was actually named Karen. Life writes its own jokes sometimes. Brenda called the meeting to order with the air of someone facing a firing squad. Thank you all for coming. I understand there have been some concerns about water issues in certain properties. Concerns? A man I didn't know stood up in the third row. My house has $10,000 in water damage and it's getting worse by the hour. This isn't a concern, it's a disaster. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Brenda held up a hand. The board is taking these issues very seriously. We've reached out to our engineering consultant to assess the situation. You mean Rick Paulson? Greg stood up, and I saw he had a folder full of papers. The unlicensed hack who happens to be your brother-in-law. The same Rick Paulson who's been cited 3 times by the State Engineering Board for incompetent work. Brenda's face went red. Mr. Paulson is a qualified professional who was hired through the proper channels. Show us the permits, I called out from my seat. Show us the environmental permits for blocking a natural waterway. The room went silent. Brenda looked at Todd, who looked at Karen, who shuffled through some papers with increasing desperation. Finally, Todd cleared his throat. The permits are being processed through the appropriate agencies. The work was done in accordance with our interpretation of the HOA's authority over common area drainage. That's not a drainage ditch, Greg shot back. That's a natural creek that's been there for thousands of years. It's registered with the county. You can't just block it because you feel like it. And now all our homes are flooding because you've created a dam that's backing up groundwater across 42 properties. The meeting devolved into chaos. Homeowners shouted questions and accusations. Brenda tried to maintain order but lost control within minutes. Finally, she stood up and announced that the board would be consulting with legal counsel and would provide updates via email. Then she, Todd, and Karen practically fled from the room while homeowners yelled after them. I caught up with Greg in the parking lot. What happens now? Now we force their hand. I'm organizing the affected homeowners into a group. We're going to hire a lawyer and sue the HOA collectively. You want in? I've already got Marcus Webb working on my individual case. The real estate guy. He's good. Look, we can coordinate. Strength in numbers. The more people demanding they remove those barriers, the harder it gets for them to refuse. We exchanged information and agreed to stay in touch. I spent the rest of the weekend documenting the increasing water damage. By Sunday evening, I had 8 inches of standing water in my garage. The ground around my foundation was completely saturated, and the backed-up creek had created a pond that covered nearly an acre of my property. Monday morning, Marcus called with an update. I've filed a civil lawsuit against the HOA on your behalf. We're seeking immediate removal of the barriers, full restoration of the natural creek bed, compensation for all water damage, punitive damages for ignoring the cease and desist, and legal fees. I'm also filing a motion for a temporary restraining order that would force them to remove the barriers while the lawsuit is pending. How long until we get a hearing? Judge's calendar shows an opening Thursday morning. Can you make it? I'll be there. Tuesday brought rain. Not a lot by most standards, but in the desert, even 2 inches of rain is significant. The storm rolled in from California, dropping steady precipitation from dawn until mid-afternoon. Under normal circumstances, that rain would have run off the slopes, flowed into my creek, and carried away toward Lake Las Vegas. Instead, it hit the concrete barriers and had nowhere to go. By Tuesday evening, the water level behind the first barrier had risen to over 8 feet. The creek had become a lake, spreading across my property and into 6 neighboring yards. Greg called me at 8 in the evening, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Danny, my basement has 4 feet of water. 4 feet! I've lost everything down there. My workshop, my kids' playroom, 20 years of stored belongings. The water won't stop rising. Call your insurance company, document everything. This is all on the HOA. Oh, I'm documenting. I've got a waterproof camera and I'm taking video of everything." "But Danny, this is going to bankrupt people. Some of these homes have $100,000 in custom basement finishes. The HOA's insurance policy caps at $2 million total for all claims. We're going to blow past that in damages within a week." Wednesday morning, I woke up to find water seeping into my house through the foundation. It was only a 1/4 inch, pooling in the corners of my ground floor, but it meant the groundwater level had risen above my foundation slab. My house, like most in Nevada, was built on a concrete slab foundation without a basement. Water coming up through the slab meant catastrophic saturation. I called Marcus immediately. "The water's inside my house now. Document it. Photos, videos, everything. And Daniel, there's something else." I got a call from the county water authority yesterday. They received an anonymous complaint about the creek obstruction, and they're sending inspectors out today. This is going to blow up on the HOA in a very public way. The inspectors arrived at noon in a county truck. There were 2 of them, both wearing official vests and carrying tablets and cameras. I met them at my back fence and walked them through everything: the original creek condition, the barriers, the rising water, the property damage. The older inspector, whose name Tag Reed Morrison, stood at the edge of the backed-up water and shook his head slowly. "This is one of the worst cases of illegal stream alteration I've seen in 20 years. Who authorized this? The HOA. They claim they had permits. They didn't. I checked our database before we came out here. No permits were issued for any work on this waterway. This creek is protected under state law. What they've done is a misdemeanor at minimum, possibly a felony depending on the environmental damage assessment. Can you make them remove the barriers? We're issuing a cease and desist order immediately, and we'll be referring this to the district attorney's office. As for removal, we'll require it, but the HOA will have to hire contractors and submit a restoration plan. That could take weeks. People's homes are flooding right now. We don't have weeks." Morrison looked at his partner, then back at me. "Emergency circumstances might let us expedite this. Let me make some calls." By Wednesday evening, the county had issued an emergency order requiring the HOA to remove the concrete barriers within 72 hours. The order came with fines of $10,000 per day for non-compliance and potential criminal charges for environmental destruction. Brenda Hutchinson responded with an email to all homeowners stating that the board was evaluating their options and consulting with legal counsel. Thursday morning arrived with my day in court. I drove to the Henderson Courthouse in Las Vegas Valley and met Marcus in the lobby. He was wearing a sharp suit and carrying a briefcase full of documentation. "How's your house?" he asked. "Water's a half-inch deep on the ground floor now. I've moved everything I can to the second floor." "Good. Judge Reynolds is hearing our motion at 9. She's known for not tolerating nonsense from HOAs, so we've got a decent shot." The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, more like a conference room with a judge's bench. Judge Reynolds was a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and an expression that suggested she'd heard every excuse in the book. The HOA's lawyer was a nervous-looking guy named Pemberton who kept adjusting his tie. Marcus presented our case methodically. He showed photos of the creek before and after the barriers, documentation of my water damage, the cease and desist letter we'd sent, the HOA's refusal to comply, and the county's findings. Then he displayed the engineering report that Greg had obtained, showing how the creek was the primary drainage for the eastern slope. Your Honor, Marcus concluded, the defendants have willfully obstructed a natural waterway in violation of state and federal environmental protection statutes. They've ignored warnings from legal counsel, defied a county cease and desist order, and caused extensive property damage to my client and at least 41 other homeowners. We're requesting an immediate temporary restraining order requiring removal of the barriers, along with compensatory and punitive damages to be determined at trial. Judge Reynolds turned to Pemberton. Counsel, what's the HOA's position? Pemberton stood up, tugging at his tie again. Your Honor, the HOA maintains that they were acting within their authority under the development covenants to manage water drainage in common areas. They hired a qualified engineering consultant who recommended the barriers as a solution to flooding complaints. Do you have the permits for this work? The permits are pending approval from the relevant agencies. So that's a no. Did the HOA conduct an environmental impact assessment before obstructing a natural waterway? I'm not aware of any such assessment, Your Honor. Did they consult with the County Water Authority, the Nevada Department of Wildlife, or any other regulatory agency? I don't believe so, Your Honor. Judge Reynolds leaned back in her chair. Counsel, your clients have created an environmental disaster and an ongoing hazard to dozens of properties. I'm granting the temporary restraining order. The HOA will remove all concrete barriers from the creek within 72 hours and will make no further alterations to the waterway without proper permits from all relevant agencies. Additionally, I'm ordering them to pay for emergency water remediation services for all affected properties, costs to be determined and verified by independent contractors. This order is effective immediately. Do you understand? Pemberton nodded miserably. Yes, Your Honor. Good. This case will proceed to trial for the matter of damages. Clerk will schedule it. We're adjourned. I walked out of the courthouse feeling like I'd won the lottery. Marcus was grinning. That was about as good an outcome as we could hope for. Now we just need to make sure they actually comply. They didn't have much choice. By Thursday afternoon, the HOA had hired an emergency remediation company to remove the concrete barriers. The work started Friday morning with jackhammers and excavators breaking up the concrete and hauling it away in dump trucks. I watched from my back fence as they systematically destroyed what they'd spent a day building 2 weeks earlier. The creek, once freed, did what nature intended. The backed-up water surged through the gaps in the barriers, eroding soil and carrying debris downstream in a muddy torrent. Within 6 hours of removing the first barrier, the water level had dropped by 3 feet. By Friday evening, 5 of the 7 barriers were gone, and the creek was flowing freely again, though the channel was scarred and widened from the backed-up pressure. The damage to the properties, however, was done. My garage required complete remediation, including removing all the drywall, treating for mold, and replacing the concrete floor that had been compromised by water saturation. My ground floor needed similar work. The total estimate came to $73,000. Greg's basement damage was even worse. $112,000 to replace everything that had been destroyed by 4 feet of standing water. Melissa Chen's finished basement needed $95,000 in repairs. Across the 42 affected properties, the total damage exceeded $3 million. The HOA's insurance policy maxed out at $2 million. The following weeks brought a cascade of legal and financial consequences. The district attorney's office filed criminal charges against Brenda Hutchinson and the HOA board for environmental destruction and reckless endangerment. Rick Paulson, the brother-in-law consultant, was charged with fraud and practicing engineering without proper credentials. Greg's coalition of affected homeowners filed a massive class action lawsuit against the HOA, seeking full compensation for all damages plus punitive damages for gross negligence. My individual lawsuit proceeded separately, since I'd filed first and had different circumstances as the property owner through which the creek flowed. The HOA called an emergency general meeting in mid-March to address the crisis. Every homeowner in Riverside Meadows showed up, not just the affected 42. The community center was standing room only. Brenda Hutchinson was notably absent. Todd Waverly sat at the board table looking like he wanted to be anywhere else. Karen Stephenson was crying before the meeting even started. Todd cleared his throat and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. The board has been informed by our attorney that our insurance coverage is insufficient to cover the damages caused by the water management project. The carrier is also disputing coverage based on willful misconduct exclusions. We're facing personal liability in excess of $1 million. The room erupted. Homeowners shouted questions. Who approved this? Why didn't anyone check if permits were needed? How could the board be so reckless? Todd held up shaking hands. Brenda made the decision to hire her brother-in-law without putting it to a board vote. She claimed she had the authority as president to approve emergency expenditures under $5,000. The barrier installation cost $4,800. What about the damages? Someone shouted. That's $3 million, we know. The board is exploring options, including a special assessment on all homeowners to cover the shortfall. That went over about as well as a lead balloon. The idea of making every homeowner in the development pay for Brenda's catastrophic mistake nearly caused a riot. People were screaming, some were crying, and I watched Todd visibly shrink in his chair. Finally, Greg stood up and raised his voice over the chaos. There's another option. We dissolve the HOA entirely. Nevada law allows homeowners to vote for dissolution if 75% agree. Without the HOA, the insurance carrier can't hide behind corporate protections, and we can pursue personal liability claims against the individual board members who made these decisions. That got everyone's attention. A lawyer in the crowd confirmed that Greg was correct, and within an hour, we'd organized a petition for dissolution. By the end of March, we had 92% of homeowners signed on. The Riverside Meadows HOA officially ceased to exist on April 15th. Criminal proceedings moved slower. Brenda Hutchinson, Todd Waverly, and Karen Stephenson were all charged with reckless endangerment and conspiracy to commit fraud. Rick Paulson faced additional charges of criminal impersonation for representing himself as a licensed engineer. The trial was scheduled for August. My lawsuit settled in May. Marcus negotiated a payment of $150,000 from Brenda's personal assets, since she'd been acting outside her authority and the HOA's insurance refused to cover her actions. The money covered my repairs, Marcus's fees, and left me with about $30,000 in compensation for the disruption and stress. Greg's class action took longer but eventually settled for $2.7 million, funded by a combination of the HOA's insurance payout, personal liability claims against the board members, and garnishment of Rick Paulson's assets. Every affected homeowner received full compensation for their damages. The criminal trial in August was almost anticlimactic. Faced with overwhelming evidence, all 4 defendants accepted plea deals. Brenda received 2 years in prison for reckless endangerment and fraud. Todd and Karen got 18 months each with work release, since they'd cooperated with prosecutors. Rick Paulson got 3 years for fraud and criminal impersonation. By September, life in Riverside Meadows had mostly returned to normal, just without the HOA hanging over our heads. My creek was flowing naturally again, though it took most of the summer for the vegetation to recover. The County Water Authority had overseen the restoration, ensuring the creek bed was returned to its natural state, and they'd installed monitoring stations to track water quality and flow. I was sitting on my back porch one evening in late September, watching the sunset paint the spring mountains gold and purple when Greg walked over with 2 beers. "Thought you might want company," he said, handing me one. Always. How's your basement? Finished last week. Better than before, honestly. Insurance paid for upgrades. He sat down in the other chair and looked out at the creek. You know, I've lived here for 8 years and I never really paid attention to that creek before all this happened. It's actually pretty amazing. That's why I bought this place. Some people want granite countertops and 3-car garages. I wanted running water and wildlife. Well, you almost lost it because Brenda couldn't admit when she was wrong. Greg took a long drink of his beer. I looked into the original complaints that started this whole mess. You know what they were? 3 homeowners in the lower section complained about water pooling in the street after a rainstorm. Not even in their yards, just in the street. The storm drains were clogged with debris. The solution was a street sweeper and cleaning out the drains. Cost maybe $500. Instead, Brenda spent $5,000 on barriers and created $3 million in damages. Plus destroyed her own life, sent herself to prison, and dissolved the HOA. All because she couldn't be bothered to actually investigate the problem. Greg shook his head. I'm a civil engineer. I design drainage systems for a living. If she just called me, or any licensed engineer, we could have told her in 5 minutes that blocking the creek would cause exactly what happened. But she had to give the contract to her brother-in-law instead. Nepotism and incompetence. A dangerous combination. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the creek flow past in its ancient channel. A roadrunner emerged from the brush on the far bank, paused to drink, then disappeared into the desert scrub. Life was returning to the way it had been before Brenda's intervention. You ever think about moving? Greg asked. After everything that happened? Not for a second. This is my home. The creek is part of why I'm here. I wasn't going to let an HOA president's ego drive me away. Good, we need more people like you around here. People who actually give a damn about the natural environment, instead of just treating it like an inconvenience to be paved over. The following months brought a new normal to Riverside Meadows. Without the HOA, we formed a voluntary neighborhood association that handled the genuinely necessary things like maintaining the community center and organizing social events. But there were no mandatory dues, no architectural review committees, and definitely no self-appointed dictators deciding to concrete over natural waterways. Property values actually went up once word spread that we'd dissolved the HOA. Apparently, a lot of people hate HOAs and will pay a premium to live somewhere without one. My house appreciated by 15% within 6 months. Greg's place went up 20% because it had been fully renovated with insurance money. The county installed a small plaque near the creek in December, designating it as a protected waterway and natural habitat corridor. The plaque included information about the desert ecosystem and the importance of preserving natural water features. It didn't mention Brenda or the concrete barriers, but everyone in the neighborhood knew the story. I ran into Todd Waverly at the grocery store in January. He'd served his time and was trying to rebuild his life. He looked older, worn down by the experience. Daniel, he said, approaching cautiously, I owe you an apology. I should have stopped Brenda. I knew what she was doing was wrong, but I went along with it because I didn't want the confrontation. You made a bad choice, Todd. A lot of people paid the price for it. I know, I paid a price too. Lost my job, spent 18 months working community service, and my wife divorced me. But I deserved all of it. What we did to your creek, to your property, to all those homes, it was inexcusable. He paused, looking uncomfortable. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry for what it's worth. It's worth something. Thanks for saying it. He nodded and walked away, shoulders hunched. I felt a moment of pity for him. He'd been weak, not malicious, but weakness in positions of authority can be just as destructive as active malice. Brenda Hutchinson's story became something of a cautionary tale in HOA circles around Nevada. Marcus told me that several HOA management companies were using the Riverside Meadows disaster as a training example of what not to do. At least 30 HOAs across the state had revised their bylaws to require environmental impact assessments before any work involving natural features or waterways. The creek itself thrived. The county's restoration work had actually improved the habitat by removing invasive species and planting native vegetation along the banks. I saw more wildlife in the spring of the following year than I'd seen in all my previous time living there. Desert bighorn sheep came down from the mountains to drink. Coyotes hunted along the banks at dusk. Even a pair of bald eagles nested in a cottonwood tree upstream, drawn by the healthy fish population in the deeper pools. My garage and ground floor were fully restored by February, better than they'd been before the flooding. The contractor I'd hired was excellent, and the insurance money had covered upgrades to waterproofing and drainage that would prevent future problems even in extreme weather events. Greg organized a creek cleanup day in March, 1 year after the barriers had been removed. About 50 neighbors showed up with trash bags and work gloves. We spent the morning collecting debris, removing the last remnants of concrete that had been left behind, and generally restoring the area to pristine condition. Afterward, we had a barbecue in my backyard, right next to the creek that had caused so much trouble and ultimately brought the neighborhood together in a way the HOA never had. Melissa Chen brought her kids, who were fascinated by the running water and the wildlife. "You know," she said, watching her 7-year-old son try to catch tadpoles in a net, "I grew up in San Francisco. We never had anything like this. I thought living in Nevada would be all strip malls and parking lots. This is magical." That's what Brenda couldn't see. She looked at the creek and saw a problem to be solved. Never occurred to her that it might be valuable exactly as it was. Well, she learned the hard way. 2 years in prison is a hell of a lesson. By summer, you couldn't tell that anything had ever been wrong with the creek. The vegetation had fully recovered, the channel had returned to its natural width and depth, and the ecosystem was thriving. I had my paradise back, and I'd learned a valuable lesson about standing up to authority when authority is wrong. The legal system had worked, eventually. The HOA had been held accountable for their actions. The guilty parties had faced consequences. Justice, while slower than I would have liked, had been served. And most importantly, the creek still flowed through my property exactly as it had for thousands of years, exactly as it would for thousands more. I was sitting on my porch one evening in July, 2 years after the whole mess had started, when a car pulled up and a young couple got out. They walked over to my fence tentatively. "Excuse me," the woman called. "We're looking at houses in the neighborhood. The realtor said you might be willing to talk to us about what it's like living here." I walked down to meet them. They were in their late 20s, probably first-time buyers based on their nervous energy. "What do you want to know?" "Well, we heard there was some trouble with the HOA a while back, but the HOA doesn't exist anymore. We're trying to understand what happened." I gave them the abbreviated version of the story, hitting the main points without dwelling on the drama. Their eyes got wider as I talked. "So the HOA president went to prison for blocking your creek?" the man asked. "For blocking a natural waterway without permits and causing millions in damages, yes. But that's not really the lesson here. The lesson is that HOAs can be dangerous when they're run by people who think rules don't apply to them. We're better off without it." "But who handles things like common area maintenance?" the woman asked. "We have a voluntary association. People chip in for things that matter to the community. It works because everyone has a say and nobody has unilateral authority to make stupid decisions." They thanked me for my time and walked back to their car. I watched them drive away, wondering if they'd end up buying in the neighborhood. I hoped they would. Riverside Meadows had become a special place, not despite the HOA disaster, but in some ways because of it. We'd learned what mattered and what didn't. We'd learned that natural features were more valuable than perfect uniformity. We'd learned that community works better through cooperation than coercion. The creek flowed on behind me, running clear and cold from the mountain springs, carrying water and life through the desert exactly as it always had. Brenda's concrete barriers were long gone, ground up and hauled away to a landfill somewhere. But the creek remained, patient and permanent, a reminder that some things are bigger than HOA boards and neighborhood politics. I turned back to the porch and my beer, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of orange and red. Somewhere in a prison in northern Nevada, Brenda Hutchinson was probably thinking about the choices she'd made. I hoped she'd learned something from the experience. I hoped she understood now that you can't fight nature with concrete and hubris. You can only work with it, respect it, and let it do what it's been doing since long before humans arrived and would continue doing long after we were gone. The creek would outlast us all. That was the real lesson of the whole mess. And I was grateful every day that I'd fought to protect it, even when it would have been easier to give up and move away. This was my home, and these 5 acres with their natural waterway were worth every moment of stress and conflict it had taken to save them. As darkness settled over the desert, I heard the yip of coyotes in the distance, and the rustle of small animals moving through the brush along the creek. Life continuing as it should in patterns established over millennia, undisturbed by the brief and foolish intervention of a HOA president who thought she knew better than thousands of years of geology and hydrology. I raised my beer in a silent toast to the creek, to justice, and to the end of the Riverside Meadows HOA. Then I went inside, leaving the desert night to the wildlife and the endless music of running water finding its way through ancient channels carved in stone and sand.